Wanted to ask you about growing up in LA. I know that you moved there very young,
Yeah,
and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about growing up in LA, your experiences, not necessarily school and all that stuff, but what was it like in LA in the 50s and 60s?
it was. Well, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, one of the suburbs of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is such a sprawling city, and there's so many different aspects to it. But the San Fernando Valley was really a magical place. It was interesting because you had a lot of it was built around the movies, movie stars. The West Valley, I think Walter Brennan owned a huge chunk of the West Valley. Um,
Bob
Bob
Hope.
Hope, Bob Hope had, like the Toluca Lake area and all that. But I knew guys like in school, I was like one of the Valley kids. But if you were south of Ventura Boulevard, where it went up into Encino and stuff, then you had, the kids whose, the dads were like Jock Mahoney and this Sally Field. I went to school with Sally Field and her dad, and Dennis Weaver and Steve Allen and Clark Gable, all those people. So there was like everybody got along, but it was two very different worlds in there. North and south of the Ventura Boulevard was a real delineation. But I grew up in Van Nuys, which is kind of dead center in it. I grew up next to the Van Nuys Airport, and my house backed onto a wash, which years later, they came through with machinery and concreted the whole thing into a real storm drain kind of thing. But when we were kids, it was just we'd go down there and there'd be frogs and stuff,
Oh,
and we could hike up that, and if we hiked up from like my backyard up this wash, if we went up there about a mile, we ended up at the 146th Fighter Wing, which was the Air National Guard, and we'd go up there as little kids, and the guys would be working on jets, and they go, "Hey, want to sit in the jet?" And so it was so loose, times were so loose there. The world kind of ended at Topanga Canyon, which was the west end of the valley, where now there's development all the way to Santa Barbara up there. But at that time, it was really kind of the end of the world when you got there. And then if you went up from that, you would end up in Chatsworth, and the hills there were where they filmed tons of westerns.
oh yeah.
Were up there, so there's fabulous rock formations and everything, and that still is all up there. Um, when I was a kid, there in the north side of the valley was a huge amount of orange groves. And at one point, they came in and bulldozed all that out and built San Fernando Valley State College up there. And it was sad to see that happen, but there was an energy in the valley. I remember Craig Durgee, our old keyboard player, his wife used to call Ventura Boulevard the Street of Dreams because there wasn't nothing you couldn't find on that boulevard. There was so much going on. But as a kid, I remember looking up at the hills, and the only way to get from the valley over to the west side was on a street called Sepulveda.
Oh yeah.
And Sepulveda was just a street, and that was literally the only way. And then at one point, they came in and started blowing the hills up, and that's when they put in the San Diego Freeway. But the mountains around it were so high, there was no way they were going to go up and over it. So they had to create a massive notch in there because there was just no way physically that cars could go up the incline that was going to be required to get out of the valley. So it was interesting as a kid watching that happen. Uh, when they decided to expand the Van Nuys Airport, they wanted to extend the runway. Uh, so they ended up building an underpass there. And as kids, we were down there hanging out, watching these guys excavating down there. And then we'd go racing down with our bikes in there. And then as we got older, it would the thing everybody liked to do was drive their car down there and then shut it off and start it up so it would backfire in this tunnel and stuff. But I had just so many memories. There used to be, in one of the main drags was Van Nuys Boulevard, which was really kind of out of American graffiti. Wednesday, there was Bob's Big Boy there, and on Wednesday nights it was cruise night, and all the hot rods were out at that point, and it was such an amazing scene. And there was one restaurant on there called the Choo Choo Burger, and it was just a giant horseshoe counter and with a tunnel at each end of it. And then when your food was delivered, it would come out on the flatbed of an electric train,
Oh,
would come
wow.
and pull up in front of you, and you could take your food up. Well, at this point, I'm sure there's so many assholes in the world, they would be putting toothpicks down and derailing the train and all that. But there
Right.
was there was an you don't want to say, oh, those were the good old days. There were aspects of it that were the good old days. But when you look at a lot of sociological things and things that were going on back in that period, it wasn't great for everybody. But there was a certain kind of a simplicity and a naivete and all of that. So certain things, I mean, when I think back to, like when it was Halloween, it was no big deal for the kids to be out way after dark, going to houses where they were making baked goods and giving you cupcakes. And where now everybody, anytime you get any of that stuff, they say go to have it x-rayed, make sure there's no razor blades. And, it's a different world that we live in now. But as a kid growing up in the valley, one of the problems with the valley was the infrastructure wasn't great. And when we would get major rainstorms, the valley would flood like there
Mhm.
was no tomorrow. The all the uh, culverts and all of the drainage system in there would get clogged up really fast, and trying to drive through intersections and just your engine would bottom out in it. You'd be stuck there. So, but I was really happy to have grown up during that period. There was a like when I talked to George Lucas about that, and because we were talking about American graffiti and all that, and we were trading notes about him kind of in the Bakersfield area growing up with that. And I said, it's just like Valley was at that point, where the Valley now is really very crowded, very congested. Um, there's still a lot, a lot of home studios. So I go out there on a pretty regular basis to work and stuff, but it's just not that kind of Mayberry-esque place that I grew up in.
When you were talking about the Boulevard, is Jackson Brown grew up out there? Is that part of what he made into a song? Is it Sepulveda and Ventura Boulevard?
No, I think Jackson grew up in a different part of town. I think I'm trying to remember where their family house was. I think their family house was closer to where I live now in Pasadena. I think they were down like in Highland Park. So they were more east of the San Fernando. It's like you have the San Fernando Valley, and as soon as you go east and leave the valley, that's when you go to Burbank and Glendale and Pasadena. And then south of where I live is where you have all these other communities. And I think that was the area where Jackson was. And I think he still has the family house there, which is I think an old stone house. It's really cool. I just saw him last night. He was at the screening. Uh, it was great to see him. He's been such a heavy supporter for the documentary. It's really great.